We have Mick Bradley and Lance Campbell, and their topic tonight is Double Vision, the making of city streets. Lance Campbell is a writer and Mick Bradley is a photographer, and they've come together to produce a book. Both of them are well known and respected in their respective fields. Lance is an arts and sports writer and currently edits arts and architecture for Essay Life magazine, which a lot of you will probably be quite familiar with. Mick's career has covered a range of fields: fine art printer, darkroom operator and professional photographer. As I said, they've come together to produce this book. It came out of a collection of photographs of the city of Adelaide taken over 80 years ago. But I'm not going to say any more than that. I'm going to let them tell you how this project came about and what it entailed. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. A pleasure to be here. You're the biggest crowd we've pulled so far, so it's a credit to you all. Yes, I wrote the book, or let's say I contributed to the words to the book. I'll start with a little boast, not about Mick or myself, but about the book itself. It's actually a local bestseller. It was published last August and sold out by October, which I thought was amazing in these times for a coffee table book. So we're very proud of that. So the first shipload sold out by then and the second shipload arrived in December. You're all historians or historical people. I'd have to say that Mick and I are, in a sense, not true historians, but as a journalist, I'm an accidental historian. I can't write without history, and in Mick and work like this can't take photographs without a sense of history. So we decided with this book that there are many history books about Adelaide and they are very worthy and just terrific to have. But we thought this was an opportunity with two sets of photographs just to go a little further out into the readership and perhaps produce a book that would send this part of Adelaide further into the community, and that's what's turned out to be the case. So that's the end of the boast. But we're still very pleased, very proud of what we've managed to produce. There was a fellow called Gustav Herman Baring, born in Tanunda, we believe, although he has no birth certificate. Grew up in Broken Hill. His first job was as a pastry chef, an apprentice pastry chef. He thought that was a bit sort of soft for someone like him, so he joined the Barrier Truth and became a printer. Then his family came to Adelaide. His dad was a printer too, I gather, Julius. And they set up in Weymouth Street, and through that they created a printing company that many of you might remember, G.H. Baring and Co., which was a strong publishing house in South Australia right up until the 70s and 80s, when it didn't quite cope with computerisation. So the company no longer exists, but certainly Gustav, as he was known to his clients, and Herman, as he was known to his family, was quite a towering figure, even though he was only about my height, in publishing in his time. He published the first footy budget, which many of you will remember, which still goes on today, when Ross and Keith Smith were flying from England to Australia for their successful record attempt. He capitalised on it and put out a newspaper called the Adelaide Aeroplane, which folded soon after Sir Ross and Keith Smith finally arrived in Adelaide in March 1920 because its job was done. But he was that sort of entrepreneur. And as I started to research him, I really grew to like him. He was a lovely bloke, a man of many parts. He played the cello, he wrote music. In fact, he wrote an anthem for a national anthem competition, which didn't win the day, but which became very popular, and I discovered it on the internet while I was researching this book. And we're actually still hoping that we'll get someone, say like Greta Bradman, who I've approached, to actually sing it for us all one day. She's heard an arrangement of it and says it's a lovely bush tune, typical of its day, and that was in the late 1920s. So this man was really someone who never wasted a moment. He was married twice. He had 8 children by his first wife, and she died in childbirth of the 8th child, which caused over the years some sort of, within the Baring family, some dissent. They thought that 7 was probably enough. And then he had a housekeeper to look after the 8 children. And then, as is the way, he married his housekeeper and they lived happily for a long time. But it was during this period, when his children were still quite young, that he sort of conceived this idea to do a book called Progressive Adelaide, as it stands today, which was based on the centenary of South Australia, to come out in 1936. And as far as we can tell, he and he alone conceived the idea of photographing every business premise in the CBD of Adelaide in the year 1935. If we hadn't done that, we wouldn't be here tonight. So there's a lot to thank him for. But as I said, as I was more I researched him, the more I liked him. He lived across the road from Clyde Cameron in Mile End, the Labor firebrand. And they had many political discussions. He also ran a stop sign on South Road, I found out, and got fined 10 shillings with 5 shillings costs in the magistrates' court. So he wasn't perfect. But he also, I assumed, Gustav Herman Baring, that he would have been a Lutheran. So while I was setting up the initial research to write about him, I asked around. It turned out he belonged to the Church of Christ on Henley Beach Road, and I thought that's a bit odd for a man of German extraction. And I was told that Church of Christ offered Sunday school on Sunday mornings, obviously, and he could take the 8 children to Sunday school and leave them at Sunday school. Now, it's our theory that that's when he took the photographs. We began taking the photographs for this book. And those photographs became Progressive Adelaide. Like him, like us, it took him a lot longer than he thought it would take. And it just came out towards the end of the centenary year, late in 1936, called Progressive Adelaide as it stands today. There are a few copies of the book. Now, some of you might have known about the book. I didn't, which is surprising considering I'd spent most of my life in Adelaide. So it was a very pleasant surprise to me to have to be shown this thing, just full of the wonderful old ads and things like that, as well as the wonderful old photos. And a couple of blokes from the Adelaide City Council, Sandy Wilkinson and John Greenshields, found a copy in the Holdfast Bay Library, and they thought it'd be good to have a photocopy of this book for heritage work and as a reference book. And it found that there is one in the State Library kept under lock and key, and a few others have turned up since then from time to time. But it found its way to Wakefield Press, where between Sandy and Michael Bollen, the publisher Michael Bollen, they came up with the idea to do the book again. And so that's where Mick Bradley came in. Mick started taking photographs, more than 800 of them, of the city as it is today, and lined it up against the city as it was in 1936. So I'll hand you over to Mick. He did the first bit. He spent a year photographing it. I spent a year writing about it. Then we spent a year designing and publishing it. So it was a big achievement. Thanks, Mick.
Thank you. Good evening. Well, where to start? Gustav Baring, as Lance has suggested, really was the inspiration for this book. He was something of a visionary, I think, quite an extraordinary achievement for somebody working with film to go out and set about photographing. You were going to talk about this image, Lance? Yes. Is that working?
Yeah. Whenever I looked at all over the years, all the pictures of Adelaide in the 20s, 30s and 40s, it always seemed to me as though Rundle Street looked like Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Is there always so many people in it? Always. And in fact, of course, it's because there were no supermarkets and very few shopping centres. So everyone came into town to shop, including my mum. And I would come in when I was 3 years old and spend days in Rundle Street meeting people, because they all came in from all over the suburbs, and Mum knew everyone anyway. We always ended up with an ice cream nut sundae in the Johnny's cafeteria. But so it's so different now. Okay.
I'll master this thing shortly. So yes, Mr. Baring, Herman Baring, I think we refer to him as, that's what his friends called him, was, I believe, something of a visionary to actually go out and attempt to do this particular thing, to photograph each building, and then in his little printing office in Chester Street to cut and paste these things together to create these streetscapes, we start here. We have a hero shot. Yes, thank you. I was tempted to point it in the wrong direction. Thanks, Adrian. We have a hero shot at the beginning of each precinct, each chapter in the book. So King William Street, this was in fact the first photograph I took after Michael Boland approached me and said, do you think we'd be able to replicate what this man did back in 1936 and photograph all of these buildings again, reproduce his images as they appeared in his book, which indeed was the same size as the book you see down the back there, and then put ours underneath it so people could see before and after. Also, a lot of the old advertisements from the original book have been included in this and are of interest, I think, in particular to people, historians like yourselves. So it's, as I say, he'd spoken to me about it and I foolishly said, yes, I think we can. It turned out to be an enormous task, and my respect for Herman Baring increased as the time went along, because we had the advantage, of course, of digital imaging, which meant I didn't have to go out and buy film, I didn't have to process it, I didn't have to make prints, I certainly didn't have to physically cut and paste them together to make streetscapes such as this one here, down there. So this is the first section of King William Street between North Terrace and Rundle Mall. The only building remaining here, of course, is the Beehive Corner building there.
Adelaide's first picture theatre.
Adelaide's first picture theatre, Lance has just informed me. I don't suppose we'll be able to tell you people very much about the history of Adelaide that you don't already know. But there may be some gems in this book that everybody hasn't been aware of. Lance did a lot of work researching and finding stories about the buildings, and it's not always that a particular building, that sort of information is readily available. So we're moving along King William Street, and the only building here that remains is the little Whigs building there, which is quite beautiful. And what was the story with that, Lance?
Well, the feeling is that the Waterhouse building, of course, on the end goes back to the 1840s, but it's because it's such a narrow footprint that they couldn't redevelop it anyway, so they just left it there, and just as well they did.
The other aspect of speaking from the photographic point of view is that he would have had to, as I've said before, photograph each of the buildings with a single piece of film. In 1936 there were roll film cameras available, but there weren't very many, and they only just came out at around about that time, that had a rising or tilting front so that you could adjust for perspective. Now if you're standing on one side of King William Street and pointing your camera at the buildings on the other side, then you have to tilt the camera up and all of the verticals are converging. Now in the old days when he was working, perhaps with a black cloth over his head on the back of a truck, he would have needed to make those corrections in the camera. Now, we have the advantage, of course, of being able to do that in Photoshop. We take the photograph with a digital camera, we can put it into Photoshop and straighten it up. We had other difficulties that he wouldn't have been faced with. All of the detritus that now exists in the streets in front of us, which we had to eliminate, or wait for buses to move out of the way and things of that nature. There were all sorts of inherent problems, but not to detract from what this man achieved. In some instances, when there was a large building, this back in the days, I think, when there was still a consideration as to the architectural profile of the city, when they did, this is my observation looking at his photographs, that when they did start to build large tall buildings, they built them on the corners, so you still had an attractive architectural profile, and the buildings that were placed, the larger, taller buildings, as that technology or that engineering came to bear, that was considered where they were to be put. They weren't just shoved in willy-nilly. It wasn't just a question of a developer coming along, knocking something down, building something up. In the instance of the building on the end, even with the camera, what is that, the T&G? What is that building? Sorry. Which is now actually empty.
I saw the other day that there's going to become a hotel. There's a big sign up there saying a 4.5-star hotel.
Well, as long as it's not an 8-storey coffee shop, Lance, that's the thing. he still, even with a camera with movements, was unable to get directly in front of that and make the corrections. So he's moved down the street slightly and taken it at an angle. Edmund Wright house there in the middle, the only remaining, apart from the corner building. In what year was it? 1977. This is where I was married, so that's my favourite building, believe it or not. Still, she's still with me. Oh dear. So I thought this was an interesting image to leave in as much as the building in the centre there was being constructed in 1936. When he took the photograph, it was only just being built, and it's still there, fortunately.
And it's a lovely building.
It's a lovely building. The interior is still extraordinary. It's now a sort of a restaurant, bar. I don't know if any of you people have been in there in recent times, but it still has its interior splendour. Quite remarkable building. On King William Street, on the west side,
and that's North Terrace on the right. And just near it is Kither's building, which was the first pre-stressed concrete building in Adelaide. And the engineer was Sir John Monash, the army man, and that's where he made his name first before he made it again.
Oh, this is another shot taken from Government House, showing that building in 1936 being constructed. Some of these photographs that are in the book weren't. This one, for instance, wasn't in the original Herman Baring book. It's not one of his images. But when the designer, Liz Nicholson from Design By It, came to put the book together, she did a lot of research of her own and searched for images from that same year that she could include that would enhance the appearance of the book.
We found, particularly along North Terrace, that Herman photographed your building on the proviso, preferably that you put an ad in his book, or perhaps that you paid him a little reward for being in the book. Now, along North Terrace, the doctors and dentists either couldn't advertise or didn't see the need. So he rushed along North Terrace in about a day, I would have thought, compared to some of the other streets, and he left the halls of learning on the other side pretty much alone. But
Yes, indeed.
Michael and Liz, Michael the publisher, and Liz the designer, along with Mick and I, agreed that part, the Cultural Boulevard, deserved a bit, so we added that ourselves. So, and I think I'm glad we did. Yeah.
Yes, so North Terrace, in its current state, is photographed completely. And once again, Liz Nicholson researched and found images where Baring hadn't taken photographs in that particular precinct and included them. And it just adds to the book, particularly from the point of view of people like yourself, I'm sure. This is going to be totally different in a very short space of time. In fact, it already is. So no doubt there's all kinds of mixed feelings about that.
And I see Bernard Wimper's here tonight.
Bernard's here, yes.
Yeah. We've got to accept, I think, what's happening, as long as they don't touch the scoreboard and the Moreton Bays. I think I can live with it. If that goes, I go. Because it's my belief that what I say is that the Adelaide Oval scoreboard is the most prominent symbol of South Australia around the world, because 1,000 million Indians watch Test cricket in India and they see that scoreboard. and the Oval is still, its reputation still is preeminent.
I should mention that we haven't included all of the photographs that are in the book for this presentation tonight, because it's quite a substantial tome, as you've probably seen. So we've just pulled images up here to give an indication of how the book looks and where there are things that are of interest, that we found of particular interest when we were working on it.
There's also one street in the book, in the original book, that we didn't do. He did one little piece of Brown Street, which is now Morford Street, just one building, where obviously that person had agreed to pay to be in the book. But Brown Street looked awful then. The building looked awful then. We went where it was, and it looks awful now.
It looks awful now. Yes.
It's a mattress shop, and we actually just didn't have it in us
to include it.
Photograph.
That's right.
So there's one address that's missing. Everything else is there.
This is the section of North Terrace, excuse me, that he did include, and very little change. So as I was saying, very little change between Gawler Place and King William Street, and a very stately part of the North Terrace, I think. Quite beautiful old buildings and
beautiful Gawler Chambers there on the left. What a waste that we can't. The old South Australian Company that we can't do something with that. Squatters now.
This is our hero shot for Hindley Street. People look at this and think, where's that? In fact, this book tends to do that quite a lot to you, because when we're walking around the city, that may not apply to people here in this room tonight, but the majority of people are they're looking at the footpath, or they're glancing in windows, or they've got a destination, they're looking at other people's faces, or waiting for the lights to change, looking for the window shopping, whatever. People don't tend to look up, but this is definitely a part of Hindley Street, and it's still there, and looks very much like this. So that's our heading for this Hindley Street chapter. West Coffee Palace, as it was known in 1936, is still with us in all its glory.
The balcony's gone, unfortunately.
Oh, yes.
John Greenshield's the former Adelaide City Council heritage architect, who's a big help for me, taking me around the streets and giving me a lot of guidance. He points out, you can see the lovely balcony there, and from that balcony you could see straight up the lane from Hindley Street to Curry Street, and then to the famous old playhouse, the old Queen's Theatre. You can actually see it from that main window there. It wouldn't be good to have the balcony back.
This particular building, he would have photographed, as indeed I did, in 3 grabs, and then joined them together. Harder than you might imagine. When I was first briefed, my brief was to replicate what he had done, so that the buildings, our streetscapes, would look similar and line up and be easy to compare. As I said before, I imagined it was going to be somewhat easier than it turned out to be. When one comes to do this, one of the things that occurred here was I would actually, just prior to photographing this particular section of Hindley Street, further down the road, I'd lifted my camera to photograph a cafe on the other side of the road, and several people dived under tables, and several other people lifted their newspapers up in front of their faces. And the proprietor came running over to me and said, "What are you doing here, photographing here? You can't photograph here." I said, "Well, it's a public place, and I'm just photographing here for the Adelaide City Council, Wakefield Press, and to try to protect myself from this guy." He said, "Well," I said, "So why do you object to me photographing the building, apart from the fact that there was obviously people there that maybe should have been elsewhere, diving under tables and things?" And he said to me that "You're just a spy photographing my new fit-out," you know, because he assumed that he had some remarkable coffee shop fittings there that somebody else was going to want to copy. Next thing that happened was, and it may have been the following day, because I think I went home then and did some work on the computer. But the next day I arrived at I think it's called Rio, the place opposite here where I took these photographs from, and I arrived there and I thought, well, I'm not going to risk anything here. I'll go in and tell this chap what I'm up to. And a chap behind the bar there said, he said, "Welcome." He said, "The boss told me you were coming. What would you like to drink?" And I thought, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, there are times when it's nice to be mistaken for somebody else, and there are times when it certainly isn't. But so they got me wrong both times, but that was a pleasant experience in the long run. So there's the result of that particular day, and I only had the one drink, so it's all still in focus. As I've mentioned before, this is the north side of Hindley Street, of course. It's between Victoria Street and Bank Street. Basically, another interesting aspect of these particular streetscapes is that you can never actually view a street like this. If you were to be about 300 metres back, standing somewhere in Weymouth Street or even further away in Perry Street, you could view it like that. But of course, when you're standing curbside, you can only see a couple of buildings. I was mentioning before about the way he went about photographing. It was precisely the same way that I went about photographing it. I thought I'd be able to do something different and easier, but it was exactly the same procedure. Nothing's changed. The laws of physics are still the same. The laws of optics are still the same. People that Google Earth people that go around photographing these very same types of streetscapes so that we can, find our way around town, presumably, or see what people are doing in their front gardens, are using exactly the same technology and are faced with the same problems. They have cameras with about 15 lenses on that photograph and stitch everything together as it goes along, but the principles are all exactly the same. And what this man did back in 1936, in its own way, is equally as sophisticated as anything that we're able to do now.
Yes, I think we almost can't imagine that he did it all on his own on Sunday mornings, but there's been no evidence that anyone else did anything. The family, as they remember him, as having a room out the back of his place in Mile End full of cameras, and he had a dark room, and so it is an assumption, but he photographed other towns as well, and nowhere else is there a byline except he did Port Lincoln as well, which we'll talk about a bit later, and someone else is credited with the photographs. Otherwise, as far as we can tell, he took the lot, which is pretty amazing. One thing this book has done is stirred up a little bit talk about the facadism of the 70s, when the easiest way to cover a 100-year-old wall, the front wall that needed cleaning or tidying or repointing.
Or you wanted it to look modern.
Yeah, which is to stick some 70s junk in front of it. And there you can see, just from the right and the bottom, a perfect example of it. Now, we don't know what's behind or how good what is behind, but there's an example of just sticking something on the front.
Louvers.
Yeah. So,
they were popular, weren't they, at the time? That's when the rot set in, I think, in the 70s.
So when we talk about how much we've lost and how much we've saved, which could go on forever, there's some stuff there that we have saved by accident, almost by default. So
yeah,
that's a small bonus anyway.
In some instances, some of these facades will be able to be perhaps removed at some point, and the original building is still there. I don't suppose it's to suggest that every building that was taken down was an architectural gem of some note. No doubt many of them were just average buildings for their time. But the point is that what's replaced them is perhaps certainly no better, and in many cases less. I hope there aren't too many architects in the room. The other, what I feel is a very unique aspect of this is my last talk about photography, is that as far as I can ascertain, this book is unique. In order to be able to do what Herman Baring did in 1936, you needed a city on a plane. You needed to be, if you tried to do this sort of thing in San Francisco, or indeed even in somewhere like Sydney, which he did go to after he'd completed this, there's enormous difficulties, because you would start with the buildings in the top left-hand corner of the page and wind with them down in the bottom right-hand corner. That's assuming that you're travelling from Town Hall to Circular Quay, for argument's sake. And so we have here, I think in South Australia perhaps, unless this has been done in some other city in Middle America, where it's flat, and somebody had the vision to go and do this type of thing 100 years ago there. And at this point, having talked to quite a number of people, nobody's put their hand up and said there is another book like this somewhere. But the fact is that, of course, you could go to cities now that are on a plane like Adelaide and take photographs and stitch them together into streetscapes. But you wouldn't have the photographs taken by a man nearly 100 years ago to compare them to. So it is possibly a unique publication in the world. Yeah, having completed this, I was foolish enough to imagine that the next step would be to go to Sydney and do. I couldn't imagine how you could possibly do it in a city like Sydney, but I'd heard that he had. So I went to the Mitchell Library and they pulled the Sydney copy up out of the basement. And indeed he did start to do something, but ground to a halt for the very reasons that I've suggested. Also, I think it was around about 1938 by then. And it is a slim volume, and what he did to overcome the problem to fill the book was to go out to Orange and Bathurst and places like that. Also, oddly enough, Katoomba, where you have this sort of rake of peculiar looking, it's just a steep slope between the township down to Echo Point. So a unique publication, I should think.
More mixed than mine, but Rundle Street East, going down to East Terrace, and North Terrace West, going down to West Terrace, actually, if we didn't have the technology that we have today, would just slope down off the page. So you wouldn't get it all there at the end of the street. So it's an advantage that we've got what we've got now.
Yep. We're able to step them up slightly, but you couldn't do it over across an area that had a distinctive slope in it. Okay. So we're on the other side of Hindley Street. this one here is of particular interest, I feel, because of that beautiful building at the top, which looks much better in the book than it does on the wall here, which has been, I think when my earliest memory of it was called Downtown or something. I don't know what it's called now, that blue. The old Wondergraph, yeah. And that's quite an extraordinary building. And there's still some lovely buildings left, aren't there? There's still some gems. As somebody remarked earlier tonight, we're often, tear our hair out about things that have gone. But in Adelaide, there's still a lot that remains. Adelaide still looks like Adelaide when you're on the street. I think that there are world cities that maintain a certain... even London, which has all these extraordinary new buildings, the Gherkin and the Shard and all these various other things, they have still maintained an architectural profile. They still have respect for the older buildings, and it's still a fascinating skyline. The same, I think, can be said, obviously, of Paris. But and I think the same, to a fair degree, can be said of Adelaide. But there aren't any other cities in Australia that have preserved what has been preserved here. And the important thing, I think, is that this book, we hope, it would appear is going to encourage people in a way to strengthen the things that remain, because they are actually looking at the before and after and seeing that there's been lots of radical change and thinking, well, why?
Or pro-heritage, thank you, or anti-either. We presented as best we could as it is. All we wanted to do was stimulate sales and debate. And so you won't find us taking too many stances, although a couple of times some of the brutality that was done was too bad to dismiss, so we have mentioned that.
We've talked about it, yeah.
Your opinion's as important as ours, that's for sure.
So we're starting, this is Rundle Mall, of course, which once again, this book is now going to be an architectural record of Rundle Mall as we all know it now, because in a very short space of time it's going to look quite different. So somebody else can come along and do this again in 50 years if they wish. That'll be a big book if they put all three of them in.
Look at 1936 up there, like Dickensian London almost. How lovely is that?
That's a beautiful section of the street back there.
As it was, anyway.
Yeah, as it was. So moving along the mall, which was a very difficult place to photograph. There's one of the advertisements from the original book, which has been included in this one.
Can I say, Mick, that's a perfect example of Herman going to a big company and saying, you've got to be in this book. They're celebrating their 72nd anniversary.
Pretty significant.
How important is that? But also, this section just brought home to me very much the time, 1936, because radio was still young, no television. The printed word was what sold things, was what sold everything. So if you buy this book and get to this second section, you read some of the most superheated, over-exaggerated prose you've ever read to sell things, to sell the smallest things. It was to buy something like a washing machine was an act of saving the empire and that sort of thing. It's just, and it's lovely stuff, but it just points out and it's so much different world then than it is now.
The sun is mostly in the northern hemisphere, as everybody is aware. So it's always easy to photograph buildings on the south side of the street because all year round the sun falls on them at some point in the day. But as regards buildings on the north side of the street, you've only got a short window, a couple of months in high summer when you can actually get the sun on these buildings. We're still on the north side of moving down the mall. Some large trees which are about to disappear, I believe. There's one of Blantz's favourite buildings.
It's the Lewis building, owned by Lewis Motorcycle and Motor and Bicycle Company, and I discovered only recently that a good friend of mine, photographer Tony Lewis, he's in the family. So that's a nice piece of Rundle Mall real estate.
Yeah, certainly is. Beautiful. So this is the way the book is laid out. We've gone down the north side of the mall, coming across to the other side between Pulteney Street and Twin Street. We venture back along the other side of the mall, and they're about to be moved balls. Rundle Street and the East End. I just joined Michael Bullen there for a coffee before I came here, and the place was just alive with people.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to me once again, as it has on previous occasions, that where the architecture hasn't been changed. It's where people like to congregate, to eat, to meet one another, to drink, just to party and have a good time. They feel comfortable.
That's interesting. Yeah, that was Mick's observation halfway through the book. He said it to me, and when we were making it, I'd never really thought about it. So I watched from then on, and he's dead right. So, but they have taken away some architecture along there, though, haven't they?
Now that's 1936, and I was faced with a quandary here. Up the ladder, I used the ladder on a 3-metre tripod so I could photograph over the top of parked cars and people, and waited for the moment to get the shot without a million things in it. And when I was taking these shots of each of the buildings individually, the way that Baring did, remarkable to think that he did, and spliced them together, because they look like a one image, but they're not. The building on the left end of the Tavistock buildings there, which was in fact the Tavistock Hotel, when I came to take the photographs, was somehow missing. It's not there. We have this. And I thought, well, that doesn't really compute, because after all, there's a street there. How could there have been a building where there's a street? And then I made some inquiries, went home, got onto the internet, and found out that there was the Tavistock Hotel, and in fact that was pulled down to create what is now Frome Street.
Yeah, in the 60s, the City Council had this idea of the town clerk went on a tour of Europe and America, and came back with the view that the motor car was all pervasive and had to be looked after at every opportunity. So he widened a tiny little street. So the council widened a tiny little street, as far as we know, called Tavistock Street, into what is now Frome Street, and took out the Tavistock Hotel and all the other buildings all the way up to Carrington Street. The plan was that it would go all the way through. The trucks would rumble through Adelaide along Frome Street, all the way up to Glenosmond Road and then on to Melbourne, which is a horrible thought.
Yeah.
And luckily, common sense prevailed in the end, but I gather it was a close thing at one stage. And you can still see evidence of it whenever you drive along there. You can see the picture actually in Rundle Street, is the lane on the other side. It's not much wider than... Ooh. But that's a lovely stretch of buildings there, and just as well that the rest were kept.
Yeah. And the mural on the wall, of course, when you tell people this story and they don't have the images in front of them, you say, well, you know where the mural is. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what would have been the front bar of the Tavistock Hotel. Actually, when I went back and looked on the computer, I Googled Tavistock, so I found Tavistock Street, referenced that, Googled Tavistock, and the next thing up came the Tavistock Hotel, and who wrote Sherlock Holmes? Arthur Conan Doyle appeared there, and I thought, the plot thickens, this is a mystery, what's he doing? In fact, he was in Adelaide at the time, but the fact is, the only reason the Tavistock Hotel appeared, because that was where he stayed when he was in London, in the London Tavistock Hotel. I have a suspicion that he may have stayed in the one here as well, because it had the same name, perhaps, who knows?
Quite possible.
But he was here. I think he became something of an occultist, and was doing his tours.
And a opium addict.
And right, well, weren't they all? Now, so moving right along, we're now between Ebenezer. No, that's not Ebenezer. That's.
We're still on the northern side.
We're still on the northern side, between what is the Exeter Hotel, and down there to, I think it's called Scuzzy these days. Coffee. Cappuccino Canyon, somebody referred to it as. But takes us right down to the end of the street, so we've come across to the south side probably just as well, and starting at the Stag and moving back up. Once again, not much change in the architecture, apart from that.
The Stag's been pretty well looked after, I think.
It has over the years. There's a few alterations here, but the profile is still low and pleasant enough, and people certainly like to congregate there. There's no doubt about that. There's another example of one of the ads that's been included in the new book that was in the old one. There's the interior of the Austral, looking very comfortable. We're moving back up, still along the south side of... there's a car park with I think it's called the Lantern on the front of it, and that's what it used to look like when it was Foy's.
And before that, the Grand Hotel, the grandest hotel in Adelaide. And I'm sure many of you remember that. I certainly do. That building, anyway.
I don't know why it affects me the way it does, but I just think that old Adelaide Steamship Company building has been sacrificed for something which is very ordinary.
This is where we did let loose. The Commonwealth government, the federal government actually lists it as destroyed.
Destroyed is the word.
Destroyed is the word.
Yeah. But Grenfell Street, a different type of facadism here.
Yes.
Yeah, Lance,
Yeah, this is where you can have the argument about keeping lovely looking frontages and putting ordinary, just to hide ordinary structures. So once again, it's another debate. But sometimes it does work, I reckon, and in Grenfell Street in a couple of places it does.
So yes, Grenfell Street, interesting story here. Once again, I was faced with a conundrum. In Herman Baring's photograph at the top, there's this rather large building that I couldn't kind of find, as you can see down below. Our theory is, and I think it's probably quite correct, is that this is one of the people that did copy. He wasn't passed. If somebody didn't buy an advertisement in his book, and perhaps he didn't particularly like them, or they were a bit gruff, then he might just eliminate their building altogether and just do that.
But in
this instance...
this is Rigby House, and of course Rigby being publishers would have been excellent clients for Herman Baring for his printing. So that's the same building at the top as at the bottom.
That's that building there. He made it larger. They coughed up big time, I reckon.
So Rigby's got a really good run.
They've even got some significant signage on the front of their building, which certainly didn't exist there at the time.
Mick's camera is the one that doesn't lie.
And confusing for me at the time, but interesting experience. Wonderful, really, to have had the privilege to do this job. And
it's interesting, though, the Tattersalls building to the left, the last fringe, with all the fringe being as enormous as it is, needs places to play. And the Tattersalls Club's got a new life, not all year round, but it's still got a life as a theatre venue during, this new era of the pop-ups, which I think is really good. And it might find a life more often during the year for theatrical performances. And that happens with a lot of the buildings all over Adelaide, North Terrace and
Harris Scarf, which is, judging by the ads I've seen on television where I'm living in Kangaroo Island at the moment, looks quite different to that now.
I went through it the other day, and I don't know how many of you have, but it's quite a nice white box, but I don't think there's much more to it. I went to every floor, and it's an open plan department store, but...
Yeah.
There was a lot in the old... I mean, obviously the old one didn't do the job, but there was a lot of old ironwork and stuff like that in it that was far more attractive, I found, than this white space.
You do get the feeling, don't you? I mean, you do get the feeling, looking at these old buildings, and you're scrutinising them for a long time when you're standing at the top of the ladder waiting for the traffic to move to get the photograph. Intricate carving and really substantial stonework, and you think the people, our forebears that built these things, they built them with a vision of a city that was going to be here forever, and these buildings weren't built to be pulled down. Whereas these are buildings in the modern era, and it's not a slight against architects as such. This is just our society now is a disposable world. These buildings aren't put up to last, you don't think. I mean, photographing in Rundle Mall, and Lance threw some light on this, I noticed that all of the old buildings on Rundle Mall were empty from the ground floor up. And I thought, why is that so? I mean, OK, they don't have fancy air conditioning units. They may not be as comfortable as the modern buildings, but they were empty. And Lance discovered the answer to this, yeah.
Well, a lot of them they didn't need. They only wanted the shop front for a quick in and out shop experience. So they took away, many places they've taken away the stairs. So there was the time capsule still sealed up above on the first and second floors. And who knows what's up there? I know there's one in Rundle Mall that's still got the original shoe measuring machines and things like that, and still shelves of shoes from the 40s still up there, I was told.
There's some discoveries to be made by you social historians that go in the middle of the night and climb up a ladder into the first floor window and find all sorts of treasures. So we're still on the in the north. So we're now on the north side between Hindmarsh.
And the building on the right housed IBM. So IBM were here in 1936, and so were Mazda around in Perry Street.
Brings us to Weymouth Street, a street which has undergone radical changes. 3 examples there of buildings that, because it's such a narrow street, Herman Baring couldn't get directly in front of them to photograph them, so they're set at an angle. All that's left is the lovely little building on the end.
Perry Street is the Bowie Street between King William and High Marsh Square, as far as we can tell, is the only part we covered that photographed where there's nothing left. It's all gone.
Yeah.
The whole lot's gone. Lovely old Hotel Adelaide and an old People's Palace.
On the north side.
North side, yeah. All
South
gone.
side we still have.
Oh, South side's got lots, yeah.
Yeah, well, still Epworth House, and these old buildings they do attract you. They do catch your eye, and there aren't so many modern buildings that do. I mean,
keep on going with it. It's Electrolux in 1936. They even rang Electrolux to see if we could use it, and they said we'll get back to you, and they never did. So we did use it. In 1936, you can use your Electrolux to paint your walls, to dry your hair, and to dry your horse. Yeah.
as you do.
And I said to a few people, this is a hilarious ad, and you can paint your house with it, and you can dry your horse with it. And a few people said, yeah. And they weren't kidding. So maybe their grandmother
It's an Electrolux.
did dry her horse with her Electrolux, but they're still going strong, aren't they?
Yeah. There are lots of people, I think, that also derive pleasure from this. My daughter, who's now 30, and is familiar with all of the modern architecture, of course, she sat with her grandmother, my wife's mother, who's now 87, for hours poring over this book. She would say, well, I remember that's where I bought my wedding dress, or that's where Stanley used to have the springs fixed on his car, and all this sort of, and it was just wonderful to see these people generations apart, sharing this and poring over it for literally for hours. I think it's been something of a hit in old people's homes too.
Yes, it has indeed. Yeah. And the other side is I put one in my local coffee shop once again, hoping to drum up sales. And this young bloke came up, pointed out that I had something to do with it. This young bloke came up to me with it in his hand and said, "Where'd you get this? This is fantastic. Where'd you get it?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact..."
In the boot of my car.
He said, I'm an architecture student, and this is just gold. Of course it is for them too, because they didn't see it like that. A lot of it is different for them. So it covers the spectrum. That's a bit of a sales pitch, but it's the way it's worked out.
Yeah, it's worked on lots of levels, I think. So here's a view of Chinatown in the market. I like to take photographs of places that are familiar to people. When you look at the photograph, you may not recognise it immediately, but then when you stop and contemplate, you think, oh yes, yeah, I know where that is. But rather than just have a classic picture postcard of something that's immediately recognisable, taken from a different angle, so it sort of evokes something a little bit differently.
It's a lovely shot.
This is Lance's Corner of the World. I've included this one tonight. Lance didn't know it was there. It's called From the Heart, this piece, and Lance has written about his corner of the world in the southwest corner.
That's where I've lived for 30 years this August. When Michael said, "Do you want to do a book about Adelaide?" I said yes before he even told me, before I even got the details, so I'm very glad I did anyway. But I was hoping it would have more about the people, but that we were following the tracks of the original book. But I thought I'd write this little piece about living in Adelaide, which I love. And the older I get, in a way, it gets even better because it's so convenient. I walk to the market. I don't use the car like I used to. I use the parklands more than I used to, and I've got my own gardeners there, so the Adelaide City Council. So, and more people are coming into the city to be with the people who live there, which I like. So, you'd have to get me out of there in a pine box, I think, or for special occasions such as this.
And interesting observations too in that piece, Lance.
I actually haven't read it since I wrote it because it took me so long to write.
I've read it a couple of times, and I think it's a lovely piece, and I think people that are interested in history and social history in particular will find that interesting to read because of your observation about the atmosphere of that corner of town, back in the old days when you first moved there to the way it's become somewhat gentrified now. And the thing of the parklands being under threat and things of that nature, there are lots of things that are worth preserving, and I would hope that this book will go some way towards people sort of thinking about that town a bit differently, because it is a city where this can be produced, and as far as I can tell, nowhere else is that quite as possible as this. So I think this might be the last image tonight. This is at the back of the book. That's behind Rundle Street East. What is that street called?
York Street?
No, it's not
York
Ebenezer.
Street?
It's the other side. It's on the south
That's Malcolm
side.
Reed's on the left. And the hotel
Yes,
on the
that's
right.
right. Malcolm,
I think it's
the
York-
rear
York
of
Street.
Malcolm Reed's on the left. If you're standing on the balcony of the Writers' Centre smoking a cigarette, which is where they go to do that sort of thing, that's the view you get, with these new buildings on the right and beautiful old stone buildings.
I think that's York Street. Barton Place might be.
Yes, it is. I remember now because there's a little record shop down there and he's advertised as York Street. So, that's all we have by way of sort of presentation of images, and if people have any questions to ask, and you've been a very appreciative, attentive audience, I must say. One's very aware of not wanting to bore people and just talk about what might be interesting. So, thanks for bearing with us. And if you do have questions, and please, if you've got anything at all you'd like to ask about, why don't you shut up? Or
I think you've done anything but bore the audience tonight.
Oh, well.
It's been an amazing story of not just what the book is, but how it came about. And I think anyone who's done historical research will quite often stand back and say, actually doing the work was more interesting than the final product. I'm not saying that's the case here, but quite often the road you go down to get to it is really fascinating. And a few things jumped out at me while you were doing it. One was the east end of Rundle Street, which, and I don't say this in a derogatory way, it survived through neglect in lots of ways.
True.
And I think part of it, and I'm willing to have me contradicted on this, I think because the market was there for so long, and the market had no reason to change. It was there for a purpose and achieved that purpose. There weren't any developers coming and say, let's build a supermarket next to the ES&A Bank in East End of Rundle Street. So it survived and we can still appreciate it.
Who remembers Randall's homemade ginger beer down there? And there was a beautiful old leather shop. There was a second-hand tool shop. I took my father there.
Hutton's leather shop.
Hutton's, yeah. So there were some beautiful shops there but the architecture remains the same. Some of those lovely old shops are gone, of course.
Yeah. I see a guy called Frank Holbrook quite often. Some of you may remember Holbrooks, who were seed merchants in the market, and he talks about he can run names up and down the street. He was there for so long. So, yeah. And
Brundy's is still there. It's still the best shoe shop in town, isn't it?
Well, all the country people went there, I know that.
Yeah. Well,
yes, just Adelaide is a large country town, which we all keep hearing, and I think if it is, it's a very large country town. In 1936, it was a large country town, and as I got further down all the streets, further towards Morford Street on one side or Pulteney on the other, I hit the chaff shops and the farm machinery shops and the car dealers and the truck dealers.
Yeah.
And which is great, and they're all in the book, all in the originals. But how many chaff shops can you write about? One of the biggest writing challenges was getting all the way to Pulteney Street or all the way to Morford Street.
Sorting out the grain from the chaff.
Yeah, exactly. And cow milking machines and milk butter separators. So same with the country, as well as the city people coming from the suburbs to shop. The country people came from the country to shop in town, as it was called.
The other comment I was going to make before I go to a question is I thought it was really interesting the fact that Herman Baring probably partially financed the book through adverts.
He had to,
It made me think of Oswald Ziegler's books as well. He was mainly in country areas, but you look at the book he did, it was called Our Orchards and Vineyards, and you think, why isn't such and such in here? And you think, oh, they didn't pay him any money.
Yeah, well, there were those commercial considerations. And had he not have been that type of man, this book wouldn't exist. That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
And look, it went back to George McEwen, 1843. He had ads in his book. And Ebenezer Ward, 1862, did it by the same way.
And the ads are nice to look at. In lots of cases, yeah. Lance, if you're going to answer.
I was going to ask the photographer. I presume you just used a full format reflex camera, and did you consider using a rising front lens at any stage?
Oh no, I didn't, because they actually, well, particularly when I started doing this, I think you can now, in fact, buy digital backs for large format cameras, but it would have been totally unnecessary in this instance. What I wanted, two reasons. One is I wanted to replicate what he'd done. So I was aiming to do something of a similar quality, not try and blow him out of the water, I wanted the photographs when they're reproduced to marry up and look comfortable together. And I used a standard 35mm SLR digital camera like this, most of the time from the top of the ladder, photographing at an angle like that to get the top of the building in, take the shot, and always at the same angle. I would put the tripod legs on the edge of the footpath and move along the footpath and photograph each building, and then put them all into the computer. I'd take 3 or 4 of each one, because sometimes there'd be cars going past and something had happened, a person's head would bob into the image and things like that. So I took a number of images and then edited those in the computer. But I didn't use a rising and falling front because there's no need. That happens now, fortunately, in Photoshop. I'd hasten to say that if Michael Bolam from Wakefield Press had have said to me, can we replicate this? If he'd have said it 10 years ago when I was still shooting with film, I said, well, not this little black duck, because it would have been an enormous task. I mean, let alone the cost of...
Now, you said that's a 35mm SLR.
SLR digital.
Yeah, and you put a bit digital back on it.
No, I say you can put a digital back on a large format camera, but there was no necessity for that. I didn't need, apart from anything else, I didn't want to have giant files, hundreds and hundreds of them. I mean, there are about 800 images, but I think I probably took about, I don't know, I think there's still 8,000 images in my laptop from this job. I haven't thrown any of them away yet for fear that I'm going to need them for some reason. I can't imagine what. So, the book's out, I can relax, I think. But that was the other consideration, is to shoot on a large format camera and have huge files would have slowed the whole process down. Not necessary,
And the other question I'd like to ask is, what did you have access to from the original book? Did you copy from the book, or did you get some of the original photos?
Sandy Wilkinson is the counsellor, he's also an architect, that took his copy of the book to Michael Bolam at Wakefield Press. What they did for me was to photocopy every page, and then I had a concertina file which my wife carried with all the photocopies of the different streets in it. One of those old-fashioned, A to Z concertina files, so that we could go along and she would be looking at it and say, no, you're on the wrong side of the street, Mick. or say that, well, that building used to be there, and that. She became quite adept at working out which building had been where and what we were actually photographing, and trying to line it up with a previous building.
And I'll ask you a rude question. Why wasn't she in that picture of the...
Why wasn't she...
In the picture of...
She took it. So that was a good question. And no, she took the photograph, and Bernard's going to ask a question. She gets the credit, yeah.
So what images did you actually use in the book? Where did the Baring images come from?
They scanned
from that publication?
Scanned from that publication, yeah. Unfortunately, we didn't have access to his original negatives, so we couldn't scan and reproduce as quite as cleanly as we might have liked to, but they did a marvellous job anyway. Yeah. Sorry, Bernard. Yeah.
Mick and Lance, wonderful presentation. Actually, I just want to add something to what you said before, the fascinating stuff about Tavistock Street. Actually, Town Clerk Veal's plans for the city were much worse than that. In actual fact, a corridor was going to be created of 3 main roads through North Adelaide, freeway type roads, one down O'Connell Street, one down Lefevre Terrace, and one down Margaret Street, which runs halfway between O'Connell Street and Lefevre Terrace. Margaret Street and Lefevre Terrace were going to sort of meet at the congregational church there at the top of Brown Place, and one was going to sweep down, as you said, right down through Frome Road, Tavistock Street, and right through to South Terrace, and meet up with Glen Osmond Road. Another one was going to veer off through the middle of the University Oval, cross another bridge, go up Kintore Avenue, which is why the York Theatre and a lot of street widening occurred at the same time in Gawler Place, that was going to drive its way right through the city as well, to also link around and hit down through Pulteney Street and meet up with Glen Osmond Road and so on. So things might have been a whole lot worse.
That's a comforting thought.
Actually, I used to go to the York Theatre as a child, and I was just in the mall 2 days ago when I had a look at Harris Scarfs, and I did look at Gawler Place and wondered why they did it. So, thank you, Bernard. I mean, obviously, would have been an absolute tragedy.
It was
so
actually,
that's one thing that's come out of the book. I've learned something as well.
It was part of the MATS plan, and that's when the residents of North Adelaide got together and said enough is enough.
Right.
Hugh Stretton and co got involved in that.
Right. Yes.
What I'm going to not actually ask you, but it's a little bit about what you said about the shops with nothing above them. I was doing a land use survey for the Adelaide City Council in 1982-83, and part of my area was Highney Street, and my job was to ask every shop owner or who owned it how many rooms in the basement, the first floor, the ground floor, and so on. And one particular shop, which was a t-shirt shop, I said to them, yes, well, that's fine, where's your staircase? And they said, we haven't got one, because they'd subdivided the shop, so there were two. And I said, well, how do you get into the second story? And they took me out to the back, and there was a big tree there, and he said, he said, we occasionally have to climb the tree. That is actually a true story.
Yes. It's interesting, in Pengelly and Nabe, the undertakers were in Rundle Street for many years, and I thought I'd follow them up, and I eventually they moved out or became Blackwell Funerals on Greenhill Road, but I met the bloke who started there as a clerk in the 60s and was part of the move out where they lost all their books and things like that. And I said, why did you move? And he said, without any sense of irony at all, he said the parking became too difficult and business became too good, and their little place in Rundle Street just wasn't big enough. So they moved. And now I think it's a sportswear shop or something like that.
Just a matter of information, Conan Doyle actually stayed in the Grand Hotel. Did he? Yes, and when it closed down, taken over by Foreign Gibsons, of course, and then when they closed, it became government departments. But there used to be a small brass plaque on the wall out the front saying that Conan Doyle stayed here in the year so-and-so, so-and-so.
Now it's Sundry Jack. You think it's still there, do you? Oh, have a look when you walk past next time. They reckon it might still be there. Yeah. Anyone else?
The one that, like that, the plaque that got me, and it's not in the book because I didn't notice it at the time, was the old Theatre Royal in Hindley Street. There's a plaque there with Sir Thomas Playford's name on it, proudly announcing that they'd knocked down the Theatre Royal to put up this car park. And it's just, once again, with no sense of irony, as though it was progress. If I'd seen it, it would have been in, that's for sure.
Just one comment about Conan Doyle. I don't think he was a opium addict. I think it was Sherlock Holmes.
You're right. There was a film, though, with Nicole Williamson in it that suggested that both of them were, but I'm sure you're right. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. You've talked about drop front or rise front cameras, but what about you used a wide angle lens? What about the barrel distortion, or were you able to Photoshop that out?
Somebody was going to ask that question eventually. It was essential to use a wide-angle lens, and in fact, Baring would have had to do the same thing, notwithstanding that he could. But of course, when you straighten up in the camera, when you do those movements to correct the perspective in the camera, then the barrel distortion actually is corrected when you do it in camera. Not so with a 35mm digital camera. Things go like this, barrel distortion. There is a facility in the Photoshop for just clicking on it and it goes chick, 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 chick. Sorry to disappoint you, but you can, most certainly. It's very easy to use. You have a graph, a grid, and what you do is you bring it in till it lines up with the vertical lines, and likewise with the bottom and top to line up with the horizontal lines. And if you go past, it's very obvious. You know, people do it purposefully in the name of art. but we were trying to get architectural accuracy here. No, I would typically use the same focal length on each street. So if I started on one end of Grenfell Street and I was using, say 35 mil, then I would stay with that because it was necessary. Otherwise, we get into all kinds of trouble. Yeah. There were lots of difficulties which I haven't bothered people with, but if you're going along a footpath and people are dining there and you want to get up and be exactly the same distance from this building as you were from the previous one, and you actually have to get on top of their table to do it, not always happy. And then you're at the top of the ladder at the level you've been all the way down the street, and all of a sudden there's an awning in front of you, and you think, okay, do I just go down below the awning and shoot this one and then try and make it match the others, or do I go back to the beginning of the street and shoot all of them at this angle? So to account for that, so I would, I learnt quite a lot, and I would walk up and down the street several times before I even commenced. Yeah, to make sure. Thank you. He did. That's an interesting question too. Lance can tell you about that.
The question was, did Baring go to Port Adelaide to take photographs?
Actually, we don't have a record of him going to Port Adelaide, but in the original Progressive Adelaide, he went to Glenelg, Seacliff, Brighton, Victor Harbour, Port Pirie, Broken Hill, Mount Gambier. Port Pirie he called the major town. Clare.
Whyalla wasn't there.
Port Adelaide wasn't. Sorry.
Whyalla wasn't.
No, Whyalla wasn't there then. Port Elliot. So he did nearly a dozen other places, not in the streetscape way that he did here.
Port Lincoln, yeah.
Yeah, Port Lincoln, which could have only just been a grain loading port in those days. Actually, I've got the list here. I won't go through it again. But he called Clare the paradise of the mid-north, and Port Pirie, South Australia's chief town. So he did go to other places, and he used them sort of as bookends of the Adelaide section. So he was even more industrious. Now we would like one day, Mick and I like to get in a bus and go and do the rest. That's up to Wakefield Press. So yes, he didn't neglect the rest of the state, but he called the book Progressive Adelaide because that's where his market was.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been a most entertaining evening, very informative. It's interesting what comes out. Conan Doyle's not going to be mentioned again, and and we learnt quite a lot about cameras too. So anyone who's interested in photography, yes. Go.
Yeah. I think, seeing we're addressing the History Society, I should make the point that without historians and without the record of the history, I doubt very much whether I could have written the words. So people like Susan Marston and Pat, they were all referred to in the writing of the book. So, and who knows how many of others of you have contributed in your own way without knowing it. So while it's not a history book, it's full of history. So thank you.